What's the scariest paranormal activity you've witnessed at work that made you quit? I worked night shift at an assisted living home. I lived in the basement apartment and carried a handheld camera walkie-talkie that let me cycle through all the security feeds. Most nights were quiet, just checking cameras to make sure no one was wandering, only going upstairs if someone fell or got up. We cared for this extremely tiny elderly woman, almost 100 years old and maybe 60 pounds. She fell a lot, at least twice a week, but she was so small that one person could easily lift her back into bed. One night, while flipping through the cameras, I saw what I thought was her standing in the hallway. It looked like a very small figure, just standing there, facing the door to her room, completely still. The moment I saw it, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone falling upstairs. I ran up the stairs, expecting to find her in the hallway. She wasn't there. She was in her room, having rolled out of bed. After I got her settled back in, she kept asking me who had been standing in the hallway. I quit that job a few weeks later. Between things like that and how often residents asked about people who weren't there, I couldn't shake the feeling something was deeply wrong with that place. Story 2. Not long ago, I worked for a roofing company in a small remote town. I was on a job at a very large house that took about a week to complete. On the first day, around noon, the crew and I were on break, sitting in front of the house when a loud, extremely creepy alarm suddenly went off inside. We couldn't turn it off, and the police had to come to stop it. When the homeowner arrived, he looked very suspiciously at us. Apparently, the alarm would only trigger if someone entered the house without entering a code. We explained that no one had gone inside. It had just gone off on its own. The second day, I was charging drill batteries in the garage when I heard what sounded like a woman cheerfully singing somewhere inside the house. I assumed it might be the homeowner's wife, even though I had never seen her. The following day, after getting off the roof, I went behind the house to get a drink from the hose. While drinking, I heard a plate or cup break inside the house, followed by the sound of a frustrated woman. I went back to the crew and told them I thought the homeowner's wife might be upset inside the house. They said they were pretty sure no one was inside. I explained that I had heard her singing the day before while I was in the garage. While we were talking, we were suddenly cut off by the alarm going off again. I was pretty creeped out, but I didn't say much. It took the homeowner about 30 minutes to arrive, and he seemed agitated when he did. He asked if anyone had tried to go inside, and we all said no. I then suggested that maybe it was his wife who had set off the alarm. He gave me a strange look and said, "That's impossible. My wife offed herself 7 months ago." I apologized and then asked if it could have been his daughter instead. He looked at me like I was crazy and asked why I assumed there was someone in his house. I explained everything I had heard coming from inside. He stared at me as if I were lying and said that no one had lived in the house since the incident. After that, I just kept my mouth shut. Then he told us that one day, while pulling into the driveway after work, he saw his wife standing by the front door in the dark. When he opened his car door, he noticed she was holding a gun. She placed it under her chin, and, I won't lie, I was relieved when we finally finished that job. After hearing all of that, everything about the place felt deeply sinister. Story 3. I was babysitting once, and she and I were in the living room watching Annie. We were munching on popcorn and enjoying the sleepover. Her 2 older brothers were out for the night. We went to the kitchen to top up the refreshments, and as we passed a sort of games room called the Den, we noticed one of her brothers stretched out on the sofa, legs crossed, watching a movie. I could see his glasses, his socks, his full outfit. We called out to him several times, but he didn't respond. Jokingly, we threw a soft toy at him. Nothing. We both went pale and got that awful sinking feeling in our stomachs. He was completely still. No natural breathing movements, like a frozen image or a projection. We ran back into the living room, turned off Annie, and climbed under our blankets to sleep. The 2 brothers returned home hours later, and it still freaks me out. Story 4. I used to work evenings at a billiards hall. The place closed at 2 a.m., but cleaning usually took an hour or more. It was a 2-story building with 15 tables on the ground floor, a large staircase in the middle, and another 10 tables in a long row upstairs. At the end of the row upstairs was a small closet-like room that nobody ever went into. That evening, it was just me and my coworker, Jerry. Before it became a billiards hall, the building belonged to a man who made and sold fancy rugs. His son ran the place, but it turned out he was involved in drugs, using the hall as a hub for transporting cocaine. One day, the owner was found dead, hanging from a noose over the 2nd-story balcony. His son had disappeared. Rumor had it, the son ran afoul of people in the drug trade. The father was killed in revenge, and the son was likely dead. The death was ruled a self-offing, though the son's disappearance suggested otherwise. One night, my boss asked Jerry and me to clean out the closet on the 2nd story. We had one of those powerful industrial-grade vacuums on wheels, which was extremely loud. We had been swamped with customers all night and realized we wouldn't have time to tackle the closet until after closing. A quick glance inside told me it would add another 15 to 20 minutes to our cleanup, so neither Jerry nor I were thrilled about it. It was about 3 a.m. when we carried the clunky vacuum upstairs and started on the closet. Jerry was using the loud industrial vacuum while I rummaged through the miscellaneous items, tossing junk in the trash and setting aside anything worth keeping. The closet was just a tiny carpeted room with a door. Even though we had changed the light bulb, it didn't work, so I figured the wiring in the wall was probably severed. When the place was renovated for billiards, some walls had been knocked down and wiring redone to run outlets to each pool table, so no cords were exposed. For lighting, we both used flashlights since it was pretty dark up there. After several minutes of cleaning, I came across an old wooden box in the corner. It had latches that had to be pressed down on both sides at the same time to open. I tucked the flashlight under my chin and opened it, and right over the drone of the vacuum, I heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a grown man screaming in terror, thrashing as if being dragged to his doom. It lasted only about 2 seconds. I let go of the box, and it snapped shut on its own. I turned to Jerry, who was crouched behind me, vacuuming. He had paused and was staring up at me. I turned off the vacuum and asked him if he had screamed. "No, I thought that was you. Where did that come from?" A look of concern washed over Jerry's face. He got up, and we both stepped out of the small room to look over the balcony at the entrance down on the ground floor. It was immediately clear. There was no way the scream had come from outside. The entrance had large, thick double doors, and even if some weirdo had decided to lean against them and scream at the top of his lungs, with the shop vac running and us all the way upstairs in another room, we wouldn't have been able to hear it. The scream had sounded like it came from right beside us in the closet. "It was like a man screaming, right?" I asked, feeling uneasy. Jerry nodded, his eyes wide. "It happened right when I tried to open this box," I said, picking it up and moving it outside the closet where there was more light. I squeezed both latches and opened it again. Inside was a large folded tarp, and beneath it was a tied rope noose. It had to be the same noose the previous owner was found with when he passed. The realization made me feel a little sick, and judging by Jerry's expression, he felt the same way. I tossed the box back into the closet, and we decided to cut our cleaning short and call it a night. I think both of us being grown men and not believing in ghosts made us too embarrassed to ever bring it up again. The scream was so distinct, even over the loud vacuum. I don't usually believe in ghosts, but for some reason, that experience still gives me chills to this day. Story 5. My dad works nights. I'm not sure whether this happened during a night shift, and it wasn't necessarily frightening. The one person he really got along with at work was the security guard. Sadly, the guard passed away. On my dad's next shift, he opened his top drawer and found a note from him, written a few days earlier, simply wishing him a good day, or something similar. I just remembered another, spookier incident. I can't recall whether it was my dad or one of his colleagues who experienced it. They were walking past the break room when they saw an elderly woman inside, wearing a green pinafore-style dress. They said hello, assuming she was a cleaner finishing her shift. The next day they mentioned it, possibly to their boss, saying they hadn't realized there was a new cleaner. They described the woman's appearance, and the boss asked about specific features. Then he pulled out his wallet and showed them a photograph, asking if that was the woman they had seen. It was the same woman. She turned out to be the boss's mother, who had passed away shortly before. Story 6. I was covering a coworker's shift. I'd already worked my usual 2 to 10, and then stayed on overnight until 7 a.m. This was a group home for disabled teenage girls. After doing my half-hour bed check, I sat down to finish the paperwork. Everyone was asleep, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw movement at the end of the hallway. One of the girls was standing there, wearing blue and white pajamas. Her features were hard to make out in the low light, so I called out softly. She immediately darted back into a bedroom. I walked down the hall and opened the door to make sure she had gotten back into bed. Both girls in the room were fast asleep. That's when it hit me. None of the residents wore blue and white pajamas. When I mentioned it to the first shift worker that morning, she just looked sad and told me I wasn't the only one who had seen the blue and white pajama girl. Before I was hired, the home had lost 3 residents, not due to staff fault, but one little girl apparently couldn't seem to stay away. Story 7. I was not a direct witness to the events below, but these are the creepiest stories I have heard, as they were relayed to me by a close friend who is a leading scientist in his field. By nature, he does not entertain the paranormal at all, and approaches everything from a strictly rational standpoint. He recounted these incidents in a matter-of-fact way, actively trying to find logical explanations for each of them. These are not tales born of wild imagination or exaggerated for effect. They are simply accounts passed on from someone with an exceptionally rigorous, logic-driven mindset who firmly rejected any paranormal interpretation yet was left genuinely baffled by his inability to find a rational explanation. He served his mandatory Army time in the Air Force and, at one point, was dispatched to a small outpost outside a medium-sized city. This outpost had been built right next to a World War II's German ossuary, which housed the remains of unidentified German soldiers excavated sometime after the war. The ossuary remained under Army property and military care once the outpost was constructed. I do not know the exact details, whether the remains were dug up during the outpost construction or why they were not returned to Germany, but I presume that post-war chaos and Army bureaucracy simply kept them there. The ossuary entrance was incorporated into the outpost building via a straight, relatively long corridor, ending at a metal door with a handle and no lock, as none was needed. There were several occurrences that struck him as odd from the moment he arrived, such as strange noises and local stray dogs and cats refusing to enter the building, even when the soldiers tried to invite them in to escape the freezing cold outside. However, being who he is, he dismissed these incidents by considering plausible explanations, ranging from wind howling and plumbing contraction as sources of the noises to specific smells or ultrasonic equipment sounds that might have disturbed the animals. Even so, there were 3 incidents that he could not adequately explain from a scientific standpoint. For one, the television in the room would often turn on entirely by itself. This was over 20 years ago, so it was an old CRT set, which allowed him to attribute the behavior to sudden power surges. What he found harder to explain, however, was that the channels would also change randomly on their own, with no one anywhere near either the television or the remote control. The second occurrence happened one morning when he encountered what he described as a spectral, ethereal shape standing roughly in the middle of the corridor leading from the outpost to the ossuary. Although he saw the apparition clearly for several seconds, he attempted to dismiss it as some form of light refraction from the corridor's skylight interacting with dust particles in the relatively enclosed space. He later admitted, however, that this took place on a dark, rainy day. The third incident was probably the most disturbing of all. The ossuary door at the end of the corridor was a heavy, solid metal one, badly rusted and difficult to open after so many years. A few weeks before the incident, it had been opened to allow cleanup after heavy rainfall had flooded the space, and it had taken considerable effort from a couple of strong soldiers to manage it. For that reason alone, it was always kept closed. One evening, he and a fellow airman were on night duty when they began to hear banging noises. As the sounds continued and grew louder, they realized they were coming from the ossuary door at the end of the corridor. They were sufficiently alarmed that his colleague took his personal service weapon with him as they went to investigate. When they entered the corridor, both immediately saw that the ossuary door was open, standing slightly ajar. This was effectively impossible. They were the only 2 people on duty in the building, and no one could have entered without passing them. The installation was isolated and enclosed, making trespassing highly unlikely, and the area had already been checked earlier during the routine sweep. Yet the corridor lights were on, and they could clearly see that the door was open. So they advanced to close it, but when they were about halfway down the corridor, the door suddenly slammed shut in front of their eyes. It did not merely close, it banged with such force that it jammed, and it took considerable effort from both of them to pry it open again. When they finally did, they inspected the room and found no person or animal inside, only its long-term residents. The cases containing the remains of the German soldiers. When I later asked him how he managed not to panic, he admitted, somewhat nervously, that even he found it really, really strange. His scientific instincts led him to consider a strong draft, as it was a windy night. But even that explanation failed to satisfy him. He could not account for what kind of draft could open a heavy metal door and then slam it shut with such force, nor how a draft could form at all, given that the ossuary had no other doors, windows, or openings through which wind could enter. Story 8. We worked at the top of a moderate skyscraper. The building would shift, and you could hear the wind on a blustery day, but nothing ever felt abnormal. One night around 10 p.m., I was sitting alone in the office when I heard a loud bang from an overhead cabinet. I jumped up, expecting to see someone there to chat. I walked over, but nobody was there. I figured something must have fallen inside someone's cabinet. I sat back down, and then I heard it again, this time all the way on the other side of the building. The floor was shaped like a square donut, with elevators, offices, and utilities in the center. I stood up and looked down the row of cubicles, about 40 of them stretching toward the purchasing department. I heard it again and watched one of the overhead cabinets mounted to a cubicle shift against the window. That's when it really scared me, and I got chills. Then it happened again, then the cabinet next to it, then the next one after that, moving down the row at increasing speed. It was like watching a line of dominoes, except they stood back up, and each one weighed about 225 kilograms. All of the overhead cabinets tipped forward far enough for the doors to swing open, but nothing fell out. Bang, 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 bang. It rushed past me, my cubicle wall tipping as well, all the way to the other end of the building. It felt like the ghost of some massive thing tore straight through me. I immediately started crying, and the goosebumps on my arms were so intense they actually hurt. The same thing happened to another night shift worker the following summer. Story 9. Night shift nurse here. I worked in a rural hospital that was pretty old. The nurse's station faced a long hallway that was known for something. Everyone had witnessed it at one point or another. It was like a shadow, but you couldn't see through it. Completely solid. It had a habit of limping down the hallway and then disappearing, or poking its head out of doorways and staring after people who had just left the room. Day or night, you always had the feeling you were being watched while walking down that hall. There were other rooms with issues too. Call lights would go off with no patients in the room. Patients would call out, asking why a man kept coming into their room, staring at them, and then leaving. The elevator doors would also open and close on their own. Story 10. I used to work at what was essentially an abandoned prison. It had been sold by the government and bought by a private developer, and the country I worked for rented it, while the developer went through the planning stages. Because the prison dated back to the Georgian era, it became popular with paranormal groups who wanted to run ghost hunts. They paid a fee to use the site, but someone from our company had to be present overnight for fire safety reasons. This wasn't my usual role, but we were a small team, so I was put on the rota to work an overnight shift with a colleague for a large booking. Our shift ran from 6 p.m. to around 4 a.m. I didn't believe in ghosts at the time, but my colleague was sensitive to that kind of thing. On paper, the job was simple. Greet the group, show them the fire exits, sync our radios, then head to the central building for the night. From there, we'd do paperwork, watch films, or play games within reason, just to stay awake, all while keeping an ear on the radio. The night went by quickly. I got along well with my colleague, and before we knew it, it was 3 a.m. The site is incredibly spooky at night, even if you know it well, but we had stayed in the main building, which was just offices. We said goodbye to the team as they left for the night and locked the main gate behind them. Then it was time to do a walk of the grounds, which allowed us to see which cell lights were still on, before going inside to switch them off and lock up. Bear in mind, it was pitch black outside. My colleague and I decided to stick together for this. We walked through the main wing and headed up the different landings to turn off the cell lights. Breezes would pass through the wings because the wing doors were left open, causing the metal cell doors to slam. We were used to this during day shifts, but it was unnerving at night. We went through the entire site, turning off lights and locking doors. This included the hanging room, the old padded cells, the wing where women and children were incarcerated. Some officers refused to work there on night shifts when the prison was in operation, and even the kitchen, among others. By this time, it was past 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning. My colleague had her car but was too tired to drive, and I didn't drive myself. It was getting late, so taking a cab home was out of the question. We decided in advance that we would stay the night. That wasn't unusual. Being a small team, we worked very hard and often ended up sleeping on site. We went up to one of the more modern blocks, built in the 2000s. In a carpeted room, we set up a heater and brought in a couple of mattresses that a production company had left behind in some of the cells. What I was aware of, but trying very hard not to think about, was that this area was where executions had been carried out before a purpose-built room was constructed. Since it wasn't uncommon for us to sleep there, we had installed a bolt on the inside of the door. During the day, it stopped visitors from wandering in. At night, it meant no one could get in while we slept. We locked it behind us and went into the room with the mattresses. My colleague was completely exhausted and on heavy medication, so the moment she lay down, she was out cold. I was exhausted too, but I struggled to settle, acutely aware of where we were. Then I started hearing doors slamming on the floor below us. I muttered to myself that it was just the wind, even though a breeze wouldn't move those fire doors, and we had only just finished closing and locking everything. It went on for about 15 minutes. Then I heard it, clear as crystal. Footsteps in the corridor directly outside the room where we were sleeping. I've never been so scared in all my life. I tried to wake my colleague, but she was completely out. Then the doorknob to the room we were sleeping in began to rattle. There was no one else in the building. We had counted everyone in and out, and we had locked the door to our sleeping area. I was petrified. I put my headphones in, turn the music up loud, and squeeze my eyes shut as tightly as I could. A few hours later, I woke, up to sunlight coming through a nearby skylight. It was around 7 a.m., and everything was silent. I packed up my things and walked to the front of the prison. The place was calm, as if nothing had happened. I ordered a cab home and slept soundly in my own bed. On my next shift, I told my boss there wasn't enough money in the world to get me to do another overnight shift. Story 11. So, my last job was as a central supply tech at a tissue bank, meaning I cleaned and sterilized the equipment used in the processing of human tendons, skin, muscle, and bone. I wasn't a third shift worker, but I did work second shift 2 days out of the week. One day, my task was to gather all the dirty equipment from the processing rooms and bring it down the hall to be decontaminated. Most jobs in central supply were done with a partner, but this one wasn't. I was completely alone, pushing carts of equipment, some of it coated in flesh and blood, down the hall to be washed. It was creepy on its own. It was gross. It was also eerily quiet. You could hear the saws and drills from the processing rooms, but not much else. The processing rooms were set up with a small chamber, where the techs would toss their dirty equipment onto a cart, and then I would collect it without entering the room, for sterility reasons. The doors leading into the chambers were automated, but you had to wave your hand in front of a small sensor to open them. That way, they wouldn't be triggered just by someone walking past. I was taking dirty equipment out of one room when I heard the sound of one of the doors farther down the hall opening. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the techs accidentally set the doors off while placing items on the cart, but it kept happening 3 or 4 times within the span of about 20 minutes. Completely at random. It wasn't like something was stuck in the door or preventing it from closing. I would hear it slide open, then slide shut, over and over. A couple of minutes later, it would slide open again. Eventually, I went to check it out to see if the techs needed something. As I walked in that direction, I actually watched the door open by itself. When I reached the room, it was empty. There was no team processing in there at all. There was no reason for the door to be opening and closing like that. I think it only happened one more time that night. I told the manager as I was leaving, just in case it was an issue with the sensor, and someone needed to look into it. But no one else ever experienced anything like that from that specific room. I never experienced this one myself, but a friend of mine did. She was in the locker room changing out of her scrubs when she heard the door open and footsteps coming in. She didn't think much of it at the time. When she finished and went to leave, there was absolutely nobody there. The women's locker room only has 2 doors in and out, and both are very loud and beep when you open them, because you have to swipe your badge to get in. From what I was told, that happens quite a lot, but only in the women's locker room. Story 12. One of the moments that truly made me question my sanity happened when I worked as a night security guard at a factory. Our cabin sat right at the entrance, overlooking the parking lot. The walls were almost entirely glass. At dusk, we had to turn off the lights inside. Otherwise, you couldn't see anything outside. We worked the night shift alone, and were expected to stay in that little cabin the entire time. As you can imagine, being alone, surrounded by darkness, with nothing but windows looking out over an almost deserted parking lot, you sometimes slipped into a heightened state of awareness. One night, while I was doing my usual busy work, I caught something in my peripheral vision. I could have sworn I saw a small shadow sprint across the parking lot, disappearing between the cars. Any sane person would shrug it off and get back to work, and that's what I did, but it happened again the next night, and the night after that. After a few nights, I was genuinely paranoid and terrified. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Either something was out there, or something was seriously messing with my head. Either way, I needed to know. So, one night, I just stood there, staring out the window for a long time. It must have looked strange to any late workers passing by. Just as I was about to accept that my mind was simply deteriorating, it appeared. A small, shadowy creature, about a foot tall, darted across the parking lot. It was hunched over and moved erratically, with a strange, lopsided hopping motion. For a moment, I was completely frozen in terror. Then I realized I was looking at a weasel. Story 13. My patient kept ringing the call bell, asking me to tell the people in her room to stop talking in Russian so she could get some sleep. Patients can get strange at night, but in this case, my Ukrainian patient from the night before had passed away earlier that day. Story 14. When I was younger, we lived on newly developed land where new houses had just been built. The area is known for how many settlers pass through, so finding unmarked graves isn't unheard of. One summer, heavy rain and clay exposed some bones in our backyard. At first, we assumed they belonged to a wild animal, but it turned out to be a baby's grave, with remains still there. A few weeks later, my younger sibling was in his room when he came out screaming and crying, saying a shadow had spoken to him. I was completely horrified, but I brushed it off as nonsense. That's how these stories usually start after all. I'm religious, but I still discount most sightings as imagination. What made me believe him was what happened next. One afternoon, while I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth and facing the mirror before a dental appointment, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A dark red tail slithered off the counter and vanished into nothing. It was about an arm's width long. I didn't see it in the mirror, but I know I saw it. It scared the hell out of me. I'm glad we moved because that wasn't the last incident. My younger brother eventually needed a nurse to care for him, and even she reported an encounter with whispering in the house. Story 15. I was closing my restaurant one night, and it was just me and a delivery girl in the building. While I was working on my closing paperwork, I heard loud sobbing coming from the bathroom. I went over, knocked on the door, and asked Maria if she was okay. The crying stopped, but she didn't answer. I thought maybe I had embarrassed her, so I went back to the office. A few minutes later, the crying started again, this time loud, heavy wailing. It sounded like she was really going through something. I went back to the bathroom, unsure of what to do, and stood outside the door for a few moments before trying the handle. It was unlocked, and the bathroom was empty. I searched for Maria and couldn't find her anywhere. I called her, only to learn that she had clocked out and left, without telling me 30 minutes earlier. I finished closing in record time and got out of there. The next day, I told my boss what had happened, and he mentioned that he believed the empty land behind the restaurant had once been a cemetery. Story 16. Not technically night shift, but we lived where we worked. At my summer theater job, we slept in these really old dorms on a college campus. I was terrified at night because I constantly felt like something was in the room with me. My blinds would lift on their own, the vinyl sheet kind you have to physically pull up. It got so bad that there were nights I slept with the lights on. I eventually bought a salt lamp nightlight from Five Below, and that actually made it feel a little less scary. Supposedly the building used to be a nursing home, but I've never been able to confirm that. At the college I attended, if we were working late in the costume shop basement, we would sometimes hear footsteps coming from upstairs, even though all the other departments had already left for the night. We tried to always work in pairs because that theater building was haunted as hell. Story 17. I was staying in my hostel room when, one night after falling asleep, I felt someone touching my hair and moving a hand across my face. I assumed it was my roommate and didn't think much of it. When I woke up though, my roommate wasn't there. Then, the next night, I saw a strange figure standing in my doorway, as if it were entering from outside. It was incredibly creepy. Story 18. There's a sighting at my work that's only happened a handful of times, and many people describe her as a girl in a red dress. We've had customers ask about the new waitress in the red dress, only for us to respond, "Ma'am, we don't know who you're talking about." A very recent occurrence involved our new chef, a 63-year-old man. He was in the back grabbing some bags of frozen food for an order when he turned around and saw someone on the other side of the room staring at him. My manager walked in and said he was white as a ghost. He turned to my manager and back to where the lady in the red dress had been. She was gone, and he had goosebumps all over his arms. I'm not saying there's no other explanation, but what the hell is going on at my work, lol? Story 19. A few years ago, when I was working in a casino, something weird happened at 4 a.m. after the casino had closed. We found one of the slot chairs lying on the ground. These chairs are extremely heavy and stable, built to handle lots of people sitting in them all day. When we checked the surveillance footage, we saw the chair against the slot machine. Then, just on its own, it leaned back and fell over. None of the legs were broken, and there was no other damage. It became the talk of the casino for a while. Story 20. I drive a late-night limo and shuttle service for my employer. One night, I was driving one of our limo-style shuttles and was almost at the destination, with just one couple in the back. They were a little buzzed and chatting among themselves. The area around this destination isn't great, so there are a lot of homeless and generally shady people wandering around at all hours, and I'm very used to seeing them. On this particular trip, though, I glanced toward a small concrete island with a yield sign on it and saw a figure covered in what looked like a ragged cloak. I wasn't alarmed at first. It's not uncommon to see homeless people throw blankets or other things over their heads, and it was late October, so the nights were starting to get cooler. But then I noticed how frigging tall this person, or thing, was. It was as tall as the yield sign, so it had to be, 12 to 14 feet tall? That's when I went into shock. Then I saw it lift its arm and point. The arm was unnaturally long, and the skin was a dark gray. It took everything in my power not to slam on the brakes and yell, "What the heck?" But I figured sending my lovely couple flying onto the floor of the limo because I thought I saw the Grim Reaper probably wouldn't have gone over well with my manager. As for the couple, they didn't seem to notice anything at all. They were still completely wrapped up in their conversation. I dropped them off, hurried through the paperwork, and drove straight back to the area. It was only about a block from the club, but whatever I had seen was gone. Story 21. I work at a live-in treatment facility for struggling folks and their kids, kept vague for privacy and HIPAA reasons. We do regular safety sweeps at set times throughout the night, so clients know that at certain times we'll enter their rooms to make sure everyone is following safety procedures. One night, I was caring for a teething baby so the mom could sleep. The baby was screaming and wouldn't calm down for anything. I was standing in the corner of an absurdly overheated room, praying to God the kid would stop or I'd go deaf. Suddenly, the corner went ice cold. Immediate goosebumps and shivers. The baby stopped crying and was asleep within a few seconds, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end, and it felt like something was behind me. I was shaken, but the baby was asleep, so yay. The next morning, some of the families were talking about an old woman who had done their safety checks the night before, saying she stayed far too long and just stared at them. But there were only 2 of us working that night, and we were both in our mid-20s. Legend has it that the wife of the man who founded the organization died in that building over 100 years ago, and that she still comes by to make sure all the kids in her care are safe. Story 22. My Walmart. Not quite night shift, but with night. The store closing at 8:30 now, I stay well past the last customer's departure. By then, most other associates have disappeared to do their own tasks, leaving the sales floor deserted. Anyway, in the seasonal section, there are tons of plastic plates, cups, and similar items on display. I was way down the aisle, technically in a completely different department, when I watched an entire display fall, one item at a time. There were probably 100 plates, and even more cups and bowls, scattered across the floor, with more slowly teetering off the shelf and joining them. Other associates later told me they'd seen similar things happen in the past, but it really freaked me out. There was no one there, and no one could have pushed individual items off the shelf without me seeing them. That was about 3 weeks ago. Story 23. Yes, and I have no explanation for it. It was around 11 p.m. I had just finished feeding some kittens and was singing along to the radio to keep myself awake, doing a little dance for one of the dogs in a neighboring cabin who was wagging her tail at me. I work in an animal home and was in the vet clinic at the time, which often has both cats and dogs in theater cages in the same room. Suddenly, I heard a very, very distinct growl. It didn't come from the little dog. She was the only dog nearby, and I was watching her when it happened. There was no lip movement, no teeth showing, no body language at all. But I know she heard it because her hackles went up. I asked if she had growled, and she wagged her tail harder. I bent down, put my hands against the bars so she could nuzzle me, and she relaxed. I thought maybe the air conditioning unit had gone haywire, so I went to the corner to switch it off and back on. When I leaned over to turn off the radio, I heard it again, louder this time, very distinct, coming from behind me, from the opposite corner. Once again, it wasn't the little dog. She was in my full view the whole time. At that point, every hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I bolted out of there as fast as I could. I went into the next building and carried on with my shift until my colleague arrived, but I couldn't stop thinking about that growl. I know sound can carry at night, but there were no other dogs nearby at the time, and our main kennel building is soundproof so the neighbors don't complain. I didn't think much more about it until about 2 hours later, when my colleague went outside for a smoke. When he came back, he said he felt like someone was watching him the entire time, and that there was a strong smell of wet dog while he was out there. Story 24. Technically, I wasn't working, but I'll still share the story. My dad was a park ranger at a lighthouse. The grounds included the lighthouse itself and 2 houses, both former keepers' quarters. One had been turned into a museum, and the other was used as offices. One night, 2 scientists came to the lighthouse to conduct some research. My dad had to lock up after them and decided to bring me and my brother along since there wasn't much going on. After the researchers left, my father, my brother, and I were standing inside the office building. This particular building had once been used as a makeshift Civil War hospital. We had left an old, heavy door open because we were about to leave. It was the kind of door that took real effort to open or close. Just as we were getting ready to go, the door suddenly slammed shut out of nowhere. It's worth mentioning that it was a clear, cloudless night, and there was no wind at all. We ran out of there like the place was on fire. And while I never heard it myself, I know my dad's coworkers later reported hearing footsteps in both of the old houses. Story 25. I work at a jail on the East Coast and work from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Usually, there isn't much going on in terms of a paranormal activity. I've had supervisors tell me about inmates who died in cells. I walk past every night, including self-offings, but I'd never really felt anything myself. One night, though, I was working in our max security area, and something felt off. It was around 2 a.m., and it was noticeably cooler than usual down there. Around 4 a.m., my fellow officers and I got a phone call from the shift captain. He said he'd seen something strange on the camera in that section. I went down to his office to take a look. On the footage, you could see a small ball of light come out of a cell and float around the day room where inmates are normally allowed out. It hovered around a table for about 20 seconds, then went back into the cell door. Then it came out again for another 10 seconds before disappearing back inside. It wasn't a bug, because it seemed to materialize directly out of the door. It was only visible on the camera, too. We watched those sections all night, and none of us ever saw it with our own eyes. Story 26I worked in an old folks' home where there was a lot of paranormal activity, mostly benevolent. One night, I was in my office when I suddenly felt a slight chill and had the strong sense that I should walk around. I was on the second floor, and as soon as I left my office, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. I got in, pressed the button for the first floor, and stepped out. Walking down the hallway, I heard someone calling for help from one of the rooms. I went in and found a patient on the floor. She couldn't get back up. She wasn't hurt or in any real danger, but it was clear that something had wanted me to help her back into bed. Later, I found out from the patient that her sister had lived with her there and had passed away 2 years prior. Story 27. I'm not a night shift worker, but one night in a small town that's known for paranormal activity, my dad and I saw something we still can't explain. He was driving behind another truck on a back road when we both noticed a humanoid figure dart across the road just behind the truck we were following. It was about 5 feet tall, very skinny, with arms and legs that were completely out of proportion compared to a normal person. It was sprinting across the road at full speed, far faster than any human could run. Story 28. I work in an old car battery manufacturing plant from the 70s, and there's a rumor that someone, long before my time, used to shock himself with the old rectifiers to wake up, and supposedly died in the plant that way. One night, I was alone in the plant, babysitting batteries to make sure they were charging correctly. I looked down the racks where we store batteries, right where those old rectifiers used to be, and one by one, the motion detection lights started coming on, moving toward me. They stopped about 10 feet short of where I was standing, with no explanation for why they'd turned on. I've worked here for years, and I know these lights don't just randomly activate. Something like a raccoon or mouse wouldn't be enough to trigger them. Sometimes even a forklift doesn't. Needless to say, I lost my nerve that night and have never volunteered to work nights alone again. Story 29. I worked at a movie theater as the janitor, cleaning up the usual mess, melted candy bars, over-buttered popcorn, spilled soda, that sort of thing. Every night before my shift ended, I'd check to see if anyone was still around. Most of the time, the place was empty, but one night was different. I was looking around and didn't see anyone, but when I glanced up at the projection room, I saw someone staring down at me. His cold blue eyes seemed to pierce right into my soul. Normally, that would have been fine if it had been Janice, the girl running the movie, but her shift had ended 3 hours earlier. She might have forgotten to lock the door, but something about him didn't feel normal. Story 30. I live in a city where more than half of it is abandoned. I wake up before work and drive around, and everything looks like a ghost town. Restaurants, fast food places, even Walmart, all completely empty. I come home from work, and it's still the same. Sometimes the signs will change, but I never see the lights on or anyone inside. It feels unsettling, like the whole place is haunted. Spooky. Story 31. I work at a grocery store, and there's one part of the store I refuse to go into after 11 unless I'm with someone else. Right as we're closing, when there's nobody left in the store, I've seen a woman standing behind the bars at the pharmacy, an area only the head pharmacist has the keys to. It's incredibly creepy, and that whole section of the store just gives off bad vibes. After talking to 2 of my managers, I found out they've seen the same woman as well, so maybe I'm not crazy after all. Story 32. I used to work at a hotel. It was completely dead. Maybe 2 guests in the entire place since it was close to the holidays. I stayed at the front desk doing homework until about 5 a.m. Suddenly, I heard a loud clang coming from the kitchen. I ran back to check, thinking maybe a guest had wandered in through the back entrance. There was no one there. Instead, the pots were scattered all over the floor. Given how quickly I got there and the route I took, no one could have slipped past me. The side door gives a clear view of both entrances. What makes it even stranger is that the pots had been hanging on hooks. I still have no idea how they ended up on the floor. Story 33. My first real job out of college was working as an IT tech at a hospital. One night, I got called in late because I was on rotation to fix some random computer issue. What it was doesn't really matter now. On my way back to the data center, I passed a man in the hallway who was covered in burns from head to toe. His skin was as red as blood. like something straight out of a Freddy Krueger movie. He was, pushing a broom down the hall. We locked eyes, and he tipped his hat at me. After the initial half-second of shock, my brain immediately rationalized it. I thought, cool, he's rehabilitated, back at work, living a normal life. Good for him. I mean, it's a hospital. You expect to see some intense things, and I'm usually pretty unflappable. The next day, while talking with coworkers about the night shift issue, I casually mentioned the burned man. Everyone suddenly paid close attention. It clearly caught their interest. They asked my boss, who also became curious, and we started asking around to find out who he was and what his story was. After looking into it thoroughly, we were told there was no one on staff who was a severe burn survivor like that. I never saw the burned man again. I don't know if he was a specter or some kind of warning. I didn't stay at the hospital much longer and eventually moved on with my career, but if he's out there somewhere, thanks for the story, and I hope he's doing well. Story 34. I'm a summer caretaker for a 3-story, 35,000 square foot building on the side of a mountain that houses 3 restaurants. Think the Overlook Hotel and you won't be far off. I ride a snowmobile home in the spring, an ATV in the summer, and hike about 45 minutes during the in-between seasons when neither will make it up. Ghost stories about the area go back to the 1930s. When the town was known for murders and accidental deaths. I live in the basement with my cat. She's usually kept on the bottom floor, but sometimes she manages to get out. One night, in the middle of the night, I heard a massive crash above me, like pans falling in the commercial kitchen upstairs. I yelled, "Kitty, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be up there." My cat immediately popped her head up from the foot of the bed, looking just as shocked as I was. Very much a, that wasn't me. Dude, I'm right here moment. Other times, she'll suddenly freak out and come tearing out of the darkness to hide under the bed, leaving me alone to deal with whatever ghost just scared her. The bathroom lights and fan are motion activated. There's one unisex, single bathroom in the basement, tucked away behind a heavy door. I'll often walk past it late at night and see that the light and fan are on. At first, I'd open the door to check if someone was in there. Now, I've put a table in front of it, call it the ghost bathroom, and figure that if the light and fan are on at 3 a.m., I should just let him take his dump in peace. I expect the building to make noises, and I usually blame anything I hear on the machinery in the boiler room. But sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and hear a TV or radio playing very, very faintly. I'll try to track the sound down, but it only ever seems to be audible in my bedroom. I've listened for a long time, trying to figure out what song or show is playing. It's never anything I can identify, and eventually I noticed there are no commercials, no changes in the voices or music. It just goes on, uninterrupted. At night, with the lights on, I can't see outside. The huge windows just reflect everything inside. My living room is the basement coffee shop. Every once in a while, I'll hear a hiker crunching gravel outside way too late at night. I'll kill the lights and step outside to wait for them to pass. I like to make sure no one is actually approaching the building. One night I heard very distinct heavy footsteps, like someone walking in galoshes full of water. I turned off the lights and stepped outside, only to realize the sound wasn't outside at all. It was coming from deep inside the building, back toward my bedroom. I yelled, "Who's there?" And the footsteps stopped instantly. I turned on every light and slowly searched the entire building, repeatedly calling out for them to identify themselves. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. The place was completely empty. There's an old empty Forest Service shack across from me on the mountain. I've been told many times it's locked up and completely unused. Still, the lights will be on late at night at random intervals. Sometimes I swear I see something pass in front of the light. Not in the window itself, just briefly interrupting the glow. I've never seen it happen twice in the same night, which almost makes it worse, because it leaves me unsure whether I actually saw anything at all. We have mice in the walls, and they make plenty of creepy noises. But I know what mice sound like, the light pitter-patter of tiny feet. One night around 3 a.m., I walked into the kitchen and heard what I assumed was a mouse running across the ceiling tiles. I didn't think much of it at first. As I kept walking, the sound stayed just ahead of me, tile by tile, and I could see little puffs of dust and movement, as whatever it was crossed each panel. That's when I realized it only touched each ceiling tile once or twice as it moved. A stride that long, nearly 2 feet, definitely wasn't a mouse. I was freaked out enough by some of this that I reviewed the security footage from the previous week. It only records on motion activation, most of which is triggered by harmless things, like the sun moving and briefly catching the sensors. I found birds, mice, and squirrels setting off the cameras. At night, though, the footage looks like something straight out of Paranormal Activity. The top floor is almost entirely stacked with chairs, and I only go up there to water plants. Motion capture on that floor was triggered every night around 2 to 4 a.m., but no matter how long I watched, I never saw anything move to set it off. On the other 2 floors, I could always identify or see whatever caused the motion. The building has yards of clear space, perfect for playing VR. The problem is, the lights are on a timer. Turn them on to play, and after about 40 minutes, the place goes dark. VR fails, and I'm left scrambling for the switch. One night, already on edge, I decided to play the horror VR game Lies Beneath. I totally freaked out at a part of the game, and immediately afterward, the lights went out. When I finally got them back on, and the creepy girl from the game didn't appear in real life, I put the game down, and I haven't touched it since. Edit 4 days after original post. I closed the walk-in freezer door so the cat wouldn't hide in there. I didn't latch it, since we want airflow rather than a full seal. One night I found the door standing wide open. I figured it just wasn't balanced, and had swung open on its own, so I closed it again, still without latching it. It hasn't moved since. That's what bothers me. If it opened itself once, why not again? I woke up around 5 a.m., to what sounded like a doorbell, followed by a door opening. Normally that would mean a maintenance guy, and I wouldn't think twice, but they wouldn't drive all the way up here 3 hours before work. I'd also hear and see their truck, and they always announce themselves. I'm not even sure I have a doorbell. I went out into the hall calling, "Who's there?" before opening the outside door. There was no one there, no vehicle, and nothing that could explain a doorbell sound at all. The cat comes along, spending 20 seconds scratching and sniffing under the door to the ghost's bathroom. I notice the light and fan are off, so I tell her to leave the ghost alone. He's peeing. We go back to bed, but I can hear the mysterious music again. Creeped out, I decide to get up for the day and splash some water on my face. When I turn off my bathroom light and fan combo, I hear the fan in the ghost bathroom start running. I check it, and sure enough, the light is on too. Both motion activated. I move the table blocking the door and look inside. Nothing. Nothing that could trigger a motion sensor like paper towels or other small items, and there's no way for the cat to get inside. Not even a paw through the crack. Now that I think about it, the sound that woke me wasn't a doorbell. It was the elevator dinging and opening on the ground floor. It's about 5 steps from the bathroom, but there's a heavy closed and locked door in between that definitely wasn't opened. I wish I could check the security footage to see if the elevator had moved floors, but none of the cameras capture the elevator, the hallway with the bathroom, or my bedroom area. Story 35. Not me, but my mom, who has worked in a care home for the past 30 years. She's often talked about strange hot and cold spots that appear out of nowhere, and about phantom whistling echoing through the building. There have also been times when she's clearly heard someone screaming for help, rushed to check the nearby residents, and found every single one of them fast asleep. The freakiest story she ever told me, though, happened during a night shift while she was cleaning the toilets. Oh, the glamour. She suddenly felt a presence right beside her. When she turned her head, she saw a person's leg standing next to her, brogues on their feet and corduroy trousers, clear as day. Her line of sight was level with their knees. And then, just like that, they vanished. She was badly shaken afterward and still insists it wasn't a trick of the light or her imagination. Story 36. I've had several experiences over the years. I spent the better part of 17 years working night shifts at various jobs. This particular experience spans about 5 years and covers my transition from active duty military to civilian work for the military, doing essentially the same job. In early 2003, fresh to a new military base, I was sent TAD, temporary additional duty, to the base military police. I wasn't an MP by training. I was a fueler, but 2 or 3 months into the assignment, I was put on a lone overnight post at a remote gate. There was training going on, and they needed immediate access in case of an emergency. I was completely alone. It was around 1:30 in the morning. The nearest houses were over a mile away. The post was sandwiched between 2 freeways and a road, with nothing else for at least a mile north or south, and maybe 5 miles east or west. Then, out of nowhere, I heard kids laughing and playing, loud, not distant echoes. It sounded like they were within a few hundred feet, maybe closer. Fast forward about an hour. The road sergeant tried to sneak up on me from inside the base. It didn't work, but he tried. He stopped at the gate, and I stepped away to use the porta potty. When I came back, he asked me about the kids laughing, thinking it was something I was doing. I told him exactly what I had been hearing. He spent the better part of an hour driving loops along the freeway around us, convinced there had to be a broken down car nearby. He never found anything. During that time, we heard the kids 2 or 3 more times. Same laughter, same place. Still nothing there. Fast forward again to late 2008. I took another position with military police, this time as a civilian. About a month into the job, some Marines were talking before or after shift, swapping stories. One of them brought up a little kid's ghost story that a corporal had apparently told them to mess with new people. I immediately chimed in and said, that was me. Turns out, every once in a while, someone would hear them again. In 2009, I was out on a dirt road unlocking a gate. The Marine riding with me suddenly muttered, "Those frigging kids, bro." It was around 3 in the morning. We were at least 2 miles farther east into the base than that original gate, middle of nowhere. Sure enough, we heard it. Kids. Giggling. I've got a few other stories from that same base, and some from retail work after I left. Story 37. Finally, I can tell this story. It happened maybe 5 years ago when I was working second shift at a shitty strip mall. I was doing my rounds on a somewhat foggy night. One moment I was completely alone, and the next, someone jumped right in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out to check on the person. There was no one there. I looked everywhere. No blood. No damage to the car, nothing at all. I was completely freaked out. I got back in my car, drove to the opposite side of the lot, and stayed parked there until my shift was over. Story 38. I used to work the evening shift at the tutoring center, and my shift let out at 10 p.m. Our school is a Catholic school that was originally founded by nuns, and there's a long-standing rumor tied to its history. Supposedly, many years ago, a nun fell in love, and her lover proposed to her. When the church found out, they isolated her from her fiancé. Sometime later, the fiancé died. Some say he offed himself. Others say it was an accident, but no one is sure. When the nun learned of his death, she took the ring and cursed it. According to the story, anyone who finds the ring and picks it up is doomed to die in a terrible accident within 3 weeks. The ring is said to sometimes appear near the Mother Mary statue in front of the oldest building on campus. There are 3 deaths rumored to be connected to it, but each time, no one ever finds the ring and it simply reappears later. The story is so well known that even my dad, a firm non-believer in curses and ghosts, warned me never to pick up a ring if I found one on campus. I left work that night and it was blizzard-level cold, -degrees, snow sticking to your eyelashes kind of weather, and I swear, clear as day, I saw a nun standing completely still in front of the Mother Mary statue. Not even the wind was moving her clothes. She was just there. I said something like, "Hey ma'am, it's freezing out. The library's open. You should go in and warm up." She didn't respond or acknowledge me in any way. I blinked and she was gone. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind or the snow. But as I walked past the statue, perfectly placed on top of the snow, was a small gold ring. You can bet I left it there and kept walking. What really unsettled me was that for the rest of the night, I felt a strong urge to go back and pick it up, even though I had no idea why. When I walked past that spot the next morning, the ring was gone. As far as I know, no students or faculty died within the next month, so maybe the curse didn't claim its next victim. Story 39. Unbelievable timing for this question. I work nights at Home Depot stocking, and I work with my friend Jamal, who is very religious. One day, out of nowhere, we were near the front when the door automatically opened and closed by itself. We walked over, but there was nothing and no one outside. It happened again, and we watched, but that was it. A few hours later, we were in the hardware section, and the motion camera went off twice with no one anywhere near it. Jamal witnessed it too. Later, while we were throwing out cardboard at the compactor, we heard knocking on the big garage door, the kind with a chain for trucks, and when we went outside, there was no one. We laughed about it, creeped out, and I went home. When I got home, I fell asleep and woke up to find my bobblehead from my desk on the floor, along with a picture of my brother I never met, which had been on my shelf for over 2 years and had never moved. What's especially creepy is that a coworker had asked me a couple of weeks earlier if I believed in ghosts. Story 40. I was sitting in my lounge on a Monday night, watching TV and smoking a joint, when I noticed a black, shimmering, spirit-like figure moving down my hallway. I froze, unsure of what I had just seen. About half an hour later, I went to the kitchen to empty the washing machine and found it in the middle of the room, turned the opposite way, with the cord still plugged into the socket. I called my neighbor to witness it, and it took him a while to help me get it back under the counter. The strangest part, there was a huge cement block inside the machine. Story 41. I did guard duty when I was in the Marines at a headquarters building that had previously been a hospital. I worked the night shift and had to make rounds about once every hour. The building had long hallways with windows on both sides, darkness outside and light inside, which meant my reflection would move along with me as I walked. A few times, though, I could have sworn I saw reflections that were not mine, sometimes more than one person, or my reflection disappearing entirely in certain windows out of the corner of my eye. From time to time, you would also hear doors farther down the hallway closing on their own with no obvious explanation. Story 42. I worked at a small call center for insurance, so there were only about 6 other people regularly on the night shift with me. One slow day, it was just me and my friend, let's call her Bianca. Bianca received a call from someone reporting an accident. The call went something like, "Hi, I've been in an accident. A semi-driver hit me. I think I'm okay. Everything feels fuzzy. As usual, she asked for the time and location. The time the caller gave was a few minutes in the future, so we assumed the girl, let's call her Amy, was in shock, but Bianca still noted the time she started. She also got Amy's name and finished the report. A little while later, I got a call. It was a semi-driver reporting an accident at the exact same location as Amy had called about. This time, the timing made sense. It had happened a few minutes earlier, and here's the chilling part. Paramedics had already arrived and pronounced the girl. The semi-driver hit as dead on arrival. When they checked her wallet, the ID showed her name was Amy, story 43. I used to work at a psychiatric care unit. A few days earlier, a man named Frank had taken his own life. I don't want to go into too many details, but in the weeks before, he had been manic and unstoppable. In the few days before his death, he became extremely depressed. During those last days, he kept telling me he wanted to get out of his room, out of the facility for a while. We tried to help with that, and I went on many walks with him around the area. It made him feel a bit better, but that one sentence he kept repeating, "I want out of here," really stuck with me. I was so sad when he passed away and spoke a lot with his family. They were clearly very sad and mentioned that the opportunities he had to get out were really important to him. Those nights were strange. The night shifts I had before were filled with long conversations with Frank, and we had a real connection. The night shifts after his death felt empty somehow. I missed Frank, and my colleague had to help out on another unit a lot, so I was often alone. I talk to myself, especially when I'm alone, because silence can creep me out and talking makes me feel more at ease. As I passed Frank's room, I said something like, "I miss you, Frank. I really hope you're at peace now and that you're out." Right after that, the door clicked and opened slightly. I assumed another patient had somehow opened it and gone inside. When I checked, there was no one there. I closed the door again and figured it must be broken, since the door closer, the mechanism that makes the door shut on its own, had been bent because of what happened there. I did another round, and Frank's door was open a little again. I checked the room, closed it, and pushed it firmly to make sure it wasn't the wind. It stayed closed, so I continued. Later, I passed the room again. The door was open. That's when I really started to feel anxious. I checked the cameras to see if anyone had opened it intentionally, but there was no one visible on the footage. So I talked to my colleague about it. They said they had closed the door too, but assumed I had forgotten. We inspected it again. Sometimes other patients go into the rooms of people we've lost, but the strange thing was that everyone was sound asleep. It was a very quiet night. My colleague and I decided to leave the room alone and see what would happen. We left the door as it was. I swear it kept opening a little more, and every time we passed it, there was no one there. By the end of the night, the door was completely open and stayed that way. In the morning, I went into the room and checked again. Nothing. The next day, his family came to collect his belongings, and by the time I returned for my next night shift, the room was empty. The door didn't open anymore. It could have been my imagination, but I truly believe Frank went home with his family. The door wasn't repaired that day, yet it worked just fine and stayed closed. Story 44. I work overnight for a cargo service on Long Island, New York, so I'm always on the road. I've seen numerous shadowy figures walk across my headlights, almost causing me to swerve, but I usually brush it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. I've also seen a woman in a white dress walking along the road. I'll see her as clear as day and think, where is she coming from at 3 a.m. dressed like that? And then, bam! She completely disappears. It was a flat main road in an industrial area, with no trees or bushes around. All the buildings were closed for the night, so there was nowhere she could have hidden or run into. It seriously freaked me out. I've also seen the famous black dog. It ran in front of my van, and I heard a thump. I remember thinking, oh man, no. I pulled over and got out to check. There was no damage, no blood, and of course, no body of a dog. I stood there scratching my head, thinking, what in the actual hell? I got back into my van and continued driving. A short distance later, I came upon a series of red and blue emergency lights. I slowed down and saw an 18-wheeler in the trees on the side of the road. As I passed, I asked a police officer what had happened. He told me the trucker had fallen asleep and slammed into an oncoming caravan. The people in the caravan didn't survive. All I could think was that it could have been me instead of them. I was heading east, the same direction the caravan had been going, and the truck was heading west on a 2-lane road. If I hadn't pulled over to check for damage because of the dog, I would have been directly in the path of that 18-wheeler. I truly feel that the black dog saved my life that night. I will never forget it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.